Trisha and welcome back. In today's video, I am going to be doing a spoiler-free book review for Sadie by Courtney Summers. Sadie is a young adult thriller mystery story that is about Sadie, who disappears one day from her hometown, and she disappears 1 year to the day that her younger sister Maddie had been found murdered. A couple of months after her disappearance, the police have been unable to turn up any evidence in Sadie's disappearance and what may have happened to her. The only thing that they have been able to find and piece together is the fact that her car was found in a town hundreds of miles away, abandoned with all of her stuff inside. And with the police unable to make any progress in the investigation to Sadie's disappearance, Sadie's surrogate grandmother gets in contact with a podcast host to see if he is willing to help find out what happened to Sadie and maybe possibly track her down wherever she may be. Before I get into my review, I do want to mention that there are quite a few trigger warnings for this book. There may be more trigger warnings than what I know to include here, but some of the things that really are prevalent to the story, there is substance abuse, the death, murder of a child, sexual assault, child abuse and molestation, pedophilia, and child pornography. Those are the most major trigger warnings that I can put out there about this. I'm not going to talk too much about that in my review. However, if any of those topics are sensitive to you, I would probably recommend that you steer clear of this book. Now, as far as the structure and the plot goes on this story, I think that one of the most spectacular elements to this book was the structure to the story. It is told in dual perspectives. I guess perspectives is not the right term that I want to use for half of it. One half of the story is told from Sadie's perspective and what she is going through from the time that she leaves home and disappears. And then the other portion of the story is told through podcast, and it is told in podcast form, and it is told from West, who is the host of this podcast, and he's calling it The Girls, and it is his interviews with people from Sadie's hometown and people that Sadie interacted with along the way after her initial disappearance, and hit over through phone calls and in person. And the structure of this, it did such a wonderful job of telling the story and telling the story through puzzle pieces, and the way that the timelines are not happening at the same time. Things aren't found out in the same order that Sadie experiences them, but it's a puzzle that comes together, and you as the reader start putting these pieces together, sometimes at the same rate as West, as he, does this podcast and presents it to the world about Sadie's story, but sometimes you're experiencing it in the same speed that Sadie is putting these pieces together. And I think that the plot on this was incredibly well paced. It was so well written to keep me turning pages. I did not want to put this book down. I finished it in just about 2 days. I worked full shifts at work during that time, and any moment that I had, I was reading this book because I wanted to know more. I wanted to find out what happened. And it was a suspenseful that wasn't scary. It was suspenseful as it pulled at my heartstrings, and I had to know what happened next. What was the next step of Sadie's journey? But then how does West find out what the next piece of what happened to Sadie is? Where does he go, and how does he put all these pieces together? It was so well crafted of a story, and the structure and the plot. I really commend Courtney Summers for doing a beautiful job in creating the story and the way that it was told. As far as characters go on this, we don't get to see a lot of some of the characters that we do see. We get to know Sadie very intimately. We get to see the world through her eyes and her pain and her heartbreak and her her relationship with her sister and the way that she viewed that and her desire to accomplish what she has set out to do. It is so heartbreaking, and to be thrust into Sadie's perspective is an emotional roller coaster. And then we get to see not so much character depth in West as he presents these podcasts to the world, but we get to see his interviews with different people, and we get little snapshots of their lives. So a lot of these people are not fully fleshed out characters, but they're not meant to be, because they're presented in a serial type manner, and it's just little bits of conversations that we get to see that he had with these people. But we get to learn a lot about West through these podcast interviews, and his growth and desire to change on why he took on this project to begin with, to his thoughts and you know, his realization at the end of why he took it on versus the reason he thought he had taken it on to begin with. So I thought that was really nice characterization. We don't get a whole lot other than that because it's told mainly through Sadie's perspective, but I felt like the characters that we did get to see that were meant to be fleshed out were very well done. And then the setting of this story. This setting was so vivid and so well crafted that we got to see the setting through Sadie's eyes as she was going through these places, and it was so beautifully written, that the way that it was presented to us, but then also the setting as it was presented from West, because West originally had come from creating podcasts about small rural towns that seemed to have been forgotten, and he was presenting the history and the lives of people in these towns to remind others in other parts of the country that these people were out there and that these places existed and that they mattered. That he had this eye for looking into people's lives and into the towns and presenting them in a way that was also really beautifully done. And I think that between the two, it created such a beautiful, vivid picture of what these places were like. I could imagine these small towns, rundown communities, lower middle class, struggling communities that a lot of the story takes place in. It reminds me a lot of little bits and pieces of my hometown, which is a really small town. And so I think that the way that was presented was incredibly well done. So if you can't tell, I absolutely loved this book. It hurt to read. It was really emotionally devastating. I cried through the last 100 pages of the book, and I sat for a long time and I cried after, and I get emotional talking about it because I really connected to Sadie and her relationship with her sister, because I feel that way about my sister. I want to protect her from the world, and so I felt like this book really struck a chord with me that I don't think it's a book that I'll ever forget. I am not going to be surprised if this ends up as one of my favorite books of the year. I don't know why I didn't pick it up sooner, but it hurt a lot not knowing what this book was going to be about. I picked it up because it was a Muggle Studies book club pick. I didn't read any reviews on this before going into it. I kind of wish I had, because the content was so painful to read about. It hurt a lot. The graphic nature of the content, not that the content that it presented itself was graphic. It didn't explicitly explain any of the trigger warning type content that I told you about at the beginning of this review, but that content was really hard for me. And then some of the realizations that Sadie has throughout the book, that was really hard for me to process. For a book to take me on this much of a roller coaster and touch me so deeply, I have to give it 5 out of 5 stars. There is very little that I can say that, you know, might need to be improved in this book, that could have been changed to make it better, because what was presented to us was such a gift, even if it was difficult to receive, and it was difficult content. So if this is a book where the content is something that you can handle, I highly recommend it. Go into it knowing that this is going to be a tough read, but I feel like a better person for having read it. If you have read this book, let me know in the comments down below, you know, what you thought of it and what your experience was reading it. I have heard that the audiobook is fantastic for this as well, because it is a full cast audiobook, and they did full production value with adding music and sound effects and other things during the podcast portions of the story. So definitely check that out if that sounds interesting to you. So that is it for my review on Sadie by Courtney Summers. If you liked this review and you want to see more content from me, be sure to click that little subscribe button in the description box down below, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!